Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. So today we're going to be tackling gender, which is very important topic, very controversial topic these days for various reasons, mainly because of the issue of trans rights and the trans identity. That's really where a lot of this a lot of the modern discourse or that's the topic that a lot of modern discourse surrounding gender is focused on. Of course, if you go back to the feminist movement, they talked about gender as well. So it's not just related to the trans issue. Uh, so this is an interesting topic, of course, because there are just different angles one can think about it. That one can think about it. Um, like if one's a biologist, or if one's a psychologist, or if one's a cultural anthropologist, um, you might have different kind of because of your field of study. You might think about the concept of gender in a different way than someone else does. Um, so it's a little difficult to, I guess, know kind of how to begin the conversation. But I wanted to begin kind of just thinking out loud about the context in which this conversation is going on. Um, so yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons why I think that this is going to be an interesting conversation is because I've staked out my positions on on most issues, and a lot of issues we talk about end up being related to economics or freedom and liberty. Pretty much, those are like the main two things I have strong opinions on. So a lot of those foundations, when they come to this issue, sometimes they are completely irrelevant, and sometimes they are relevant in very weird tangential ways that I have to kind of synthesize with other aspects of the conversation. And I'm unlike a lot of people who are like see themselves in third parties. I come to the ANCAP kind of view of things by way of the right. I was initially like a generic conservative. I didn't have any opinion on foreign policy, and I was pretty much just a small government, like Turning Point USA type Republican like 5 years ago. So the default setting for me is the meme of like two genders, the end. Why are we having any more discussion? And but now I come to this from like I guess almost a complex view that ends in the position of indifference. And in the end, I'm fortunate that I'm a very anti-government, anti-institution person. So in the end, I like to preface my thoughts by saying, ideally, even if I had power, my views wouldn't matter. So that's if somebody finds everything I say abhorrent, at least remember I'm not trying to vote for anybody that will do anything with the levers of power, because I'm trying to abolish levers of power. So it's not like my views would really have any tangible impact, but it's still interesting to, I guess, think about and discuss. Now, I don't know where you want to start on this conversation, because I think one of the issues is, and this is why I think almost all discussions about gender or transgender issues are mostly without any value. And it's because people define these terms in completely different ways that aren't helpful, because then they just talk past each other, or they pretty much assume the other person's using their definition in the end. The issue I've come to, and I'm coming from, I guess, the place of utmost sincerity, and this is a good block, I think, to start on, unless you have a better idea, is what is gender, especially if you're not defining it in any type of so you have gender and you have biological sex, and I have a hard time even defining what gender could possibly really be. Um, and you can talk about a lot of things when you're being descriptive about a field or an instance of occurrence, and you can define, say, different groups that are impacted more. But when it comes to actually discussing what is gender, I don't even know where to start. unless you start from a basis that's similar to biological sex. And that's clearly not the basis that people on the left want to start at. So I think that's a good place to open up to you, because I don't even really know where to begin to think about this, because I just come from the opposite intuitions.
That's exactly where I thought the conversation should start. So we're on the same page on that. I think so. Gender, in some ways, it's a very subjective thing. So if a trans woman, let's say, she feels um, don't even. I mean, I don't even necessarily have to focus on trans people specifically. It's just a person that people often feel like something about. They feel like their gender is a very integral part of who they are. It seems to be a state of being which is very personal, very internal. Um, and just related to who you are as a person. And I think person there is the correct word, because I think it's really fair to say that if one is trying to think about, say, the question, is there a distinction between sex and gender? I think you could argue there is, because animals really don't have gender, I don't think, in the way that people do, because animals don't think about um, being anatomically male or anatomically female. They don't think about. I mean, they are. Their existence is much more, as far as we know, based on the instincts and basic survival, and then of course if they're social animals, then the surrounding social world around them. But humans are kind of think about themselves and others in a much deeper way. That there's a greater biographical, I guess, existence, or that makes people, that kind of separates people from cats and dogs and armadillos and flamingos, etc. So in that sense, I think it makes sense to say they're like men and women. It's not quite the same thing as male and female, because we don't say, oh, that's a woman cat or that's a man dog. That dog's a man, that cat's a woman. That doesn't make sense. We say that's a female cat and that's a male cat, but there's something about humans that, it's not just, it's not just you and I are male. We think of ourselves as, or we feel like we're men. So there does seem to be a slight distinction there, which I think some people who just say there are only two genders change my mind. I don't think they're honestly engaging with that aspect of the argument. Is that a good place to start in terms of my thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, I think that's so I don't think I really push back strongly against anything you said in particular. Um my my struggle in terms of thinking about this conversation on a deeper level is trying to actually put into words what gender means and then going from there. So like for example, I kind of posed that question, and then you said a lot of things that were valid, but a lot of what you said is descriptive of what a gender is to a person, but that didn't describe what a gender is. So it's like your gender feels like it's core to your identity. It feels like it's part of a defining element of you. But then what is actually gender? And that's where I think real roadblocks start coming up. So like to throw one of the boomer con points in the way, one of the memes from like Matt Walsh, who works for Daily Wire and has a podcast. His one of the things he says is to ask people of the left to define woman without using the word woman, and it's because a lot of things about gender, well, when you're talking about gender instead of sex, is your gender is what you identify with or feel like. So so a lot of times the definition of woman would be a person who is a woman is somebody who feels like they're a woman. But then you still don't have what a like woman is, except for somebody who feels like they're it. So I feel like that's not a very good point, or it's not not very profound point, but I feel like it's a point that is worth taking into account, because if it's hinting at there's something deeper there than just it is what people define it to be. And I think what ends up happening is when people talk about gender instead of sex, it is almost like this thing in the ether that is kind of looming, but nobody can put their finger on what it even means. And down the road in terms of conversation, I think that's one of the pivotal issues. I think ends up being a problem if you're trying to take this whole situation and apply some sort of logic to it beyond just basic expressions of individuality, which I don't have a problem with. I'm just saying if somebody's trying to put like a logical lens together, I think that ends up being an issue. And so maybe I want to see if there's more there before we kind of go off.
So, I mean, first of all, I think, so some people, I think it's easy to say like, oh, sex is just very clear cut and logical, and there's no like issues or gray areas there. That not even that is true, actually. I mean, there are people who are born intersex for a reason, or not. I mean, excuse me, they're not born for a reason, but there's the fact that intersex people exist means that a human being can be born, or an animal, I guess, can be born in such a way that you can't quite just categorize it as male, anatomically male, or anatomically female. Now you can say that that male and female, I think it does exist, but it's not as clear cut when we're trying to define it. But we're not necessarily trying to define we're not necessarily trying to define sex here. We're trying to define gender, and they're connected, of course. I guess if I were trying to define gender, and of course this, I'm not really sure there is a good definition, I'm not sure the definition you're looking for is even possible, just given what I've said before about how ignorant humans are of themselves, and how the pitiful state of the human sciences for that very reason. But I think of, that was a throwaway line, didn't? My definition would be the psychological and cultural manifestations or byproducts of sex, of people, most people, due to the fact that most people can be categorized as either anatomically male or anatomically female. I think society. So if I'm thinking about like human evolution or cultural evolution, kind of the construction of civilization, or the I think of it as our ancestors. Well, let me start with this. There are differences between a male and a female, and that even, I think, to some degree, goes not just for the body but for the mind. I think there are differences and then this goes back to like evolutionary psychology, that there are kind of distinct biological differences between a male human and a female human. But then so that's kind of what that's the building blocks you have. And then people started, agriculture developed, and people started, private property was developed, and people started hiring someone to do their labor, or capturing them and enslaving them, and just complex social structures evolved. And all that was the certain aspects of human society, it goes straight back. It goes, you can see the thread from the biology to the the human side of things. And yet, of course, the weird thing about humans is we're not just part of nature. It's weird to say it, of course, at some level, because there's no other creature, as far as we know, has been able to do it. But we're able to separate ourselves from nature, and able to kind of go against nature. So that really is my best way of defining gender. You start with biological sex, and then you think about the individual, like the individual's attitude towards him or herself, and his or her attitude towards other people, and his or her relationships with other people. And this is why gender can be. This is why gender has certain cultural or sociological aspects. If for for most of human history, as the feminists point out, being a woman was not the best thing to be in the world, in terms of things like voting rights or property rights, or just being able to do most anything. And so, certain aspects of, I guess, womanhood would be cultural. But other aspects are not cultural. Other aspects are more psychological and biological. Because if they weren't, then I don't think the concept of a woman would make any sense. So that was my little rant. You can take that in whatever direction you see fit. I hope that made sense to some extent.
Yeah, I think they're so okay. So when it comes down to it, well, for first off, just a point of clarity, I think there are some people who have addressed the relevance of intersex in a way that's appropriate, and I think that's something that affects a large amount of people, and that could still be dealt with in a way that doesn't really reframe the conversation in any way that I think is important. But I just want to acknowledge that, because I feel like if I was listening to it and then I only heard what you said and nobody responded to that, I would have been annoyed. Okay, but I don't want to go down any rabbit hole involving that. Okay, now I think where it gets confusing. So the base definition can be your biology dictates to some extent your biological if your biological sex. So it's kind of like saying your gender is how your biology interacts with the culture around you in terms of gender in terms of the dynamics between biological males and biological females. And then you have room there to explain how, even though somebody has certain types of biology, you can have a biological male in terms of chromosomes and genitals can have a brain that is more shaped like a female's brain. So then you can argue, well, their biology, even though they're deterministically in terms of sex a male, they still have these female attributes. The
And
place,
identity, by the way. I'm sorry.
well, okay,
I don't mean to interrupt, but
yeah,
that's another huge aspect of it. The individual's feeling
that's
about
exactly where I'm going with
his
it,
or
too.
her. Yeah. Okay.
So I was about to say, well, I think your definition, if anything, is incomplete about the part that is most confounding. And I think it's the part that is what makes it so controversial. And it is to the degree in which gender is internal, to the degree which it is societal, and to the degree it is external and how people treat you. So it's kind of like saying, and then I guess this is a very, I want to say crude way of putting it, and or a crude example maybe. But when somebody, if somebody perceives themselves in a way, you probably met a lot of people who perceive themselves in a way and everybody else has a complete different opinion of them. So somebody might think they're really smart and then you're like, oh my God, that guy's a complete buffoon, but he just never stops talking. And, so somebody could have this opinion on me and I can think I'm smart because I've read a book and most people don't read any books. So I'm like, oh, I feel high and mighty, but somebody might disagree with every aspect of everything I have to say and think I'm a buffoon. So what is my identity in terms of like my intelligence? Well, I'm ranking myself as having at this point because I measure in X way and I think I have the right views, but somebody can come in and think that I'm a complete idiot and I have nothing of value to contribute to anything. So all of a sudden you have these countermeasures. I think what makes the whole issue of specifically gender and people who are transgender is it's the movement of like, you see the tweets that are in all caps that say transgender females are females. It's like it's the kind of messaging that's saying somebody clearly has nailed down how they personally would prefer to be identified for whatever reason, but the external does not align with the internal. So we have this weird situation where we can somewhat define gender, although maybe I'm jumping the shark, trying to jump a step ahead of where we're at, because maybe we need to even talk about how masculinity and femininity play a role in the conversation and how somebody can even go about feeling like they are the other biological sex in terms of gender. So like, how can somebody feel like they are a man? Well, what does that even mean? Because that is in some sense, this is something that I have a hard time understanding on what that could even really mean. But I do think the internal versus external versus societal evaluation is important to at least say, well, is gender valid if some of these parties object, or what does it mean, right? And why is it so crucial that other people all get on the bandwagon, or else it's offensive? So that's two cans of worms. I'm okay with addressing femininity and masculinity's role first, because I think that's actually more important for chronological conversation. I jumped the shark a little bit. So I'll let you decide how to take that.
Well, I thought I would insert into this part of the conversation. I guess I mentioned the trans issue a little before, but I didn't get. I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and that connects to the femininity masculinity conversation, I think. So I think what you and I can agree on, or what everyone who talks about this can agree on, is no matter how hard it is to define gender, there seems to be something about humans or about culture that and we'll just call it gender for us, sake of argument. This thing called gender, it seems to be extremely important to most people at most times in history. It's perfectly fine to say we don't know what this is. No one who's defining it well, but I think that's not quite the same thing as saying there's nothing there. And I'm not saying you're saying that, by the way, but that's just a point of clarification. I think is so. I think something like gender exists, or is a legitimate category, but
well,
then yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so to some extent, okay, actually, I think we do need to reframe from this point then. So part of the reason why I think the conversation is interesting is one of my like heuristics if I don't want to think about this conversation at all, and if I was going to be lazy and give somebody like a 6-word summary a year ago, what I would probably say is everybody tends to define gender differently in a way I find very inconsistent. So biological sex seems significantly more important, especially considering people often conflate gender with sex. And most of the time, that's fine because most people identify with their sex. So most of the time, well, for whatever gender is, it's encompassed by sex. So it's less important in terms of that. Now, I run into this issue because I'm a person who considers myself anti-collectivist and hyper-individualist. And well, it's not even really an issue. It's just that I don't even think gender is necessarily that important in almost any circumstance. So when I interact with people, how often does that play a role? Similar to how I think race isn't as important as a lot of people treat it. I feel the same way about gender and sex. So you can say gender is this all-encompassing thing that's hard to define and is crucial to everybody, but how much of that is just people's biological sex, but we're deciding that the portion that is important is gender. See, this is why I find it all so I guess confusing, because for most people, for the overwhelming majority of people, you don't need to understand sex or gender. You could just call it sex and then say sex to explain all this stuff. But if we decide that how people act in real life is separate from their chromosomes and genitalia, and then that part isn't playing any impact, it's a chosen gender that is still related, but we attribute it to gender, well, then gender is significantly more important. So I guess what I'm saying is I find it all hard to pin down, because then how much of my personality do I even attribute to my gender? So like, I'm a biological male. I identify as a male for whatever that's worth, but I just act the way that I act. Now, people can attribute a lot of that to gender or a lot of that to biology. People can say I'm very low on agreeableness. This is a Jordan Peterson talking point, and I have scored very low on agreeableness, which is why I can have a podcast where I argue with you about just about anything. I score very low on it. And it's like, on average, people who are male tend to score lower on agreeability. So it's like, okay, well, how much of that do we attribute to my gender? How much do we attribute that to my biology? How much do we attribute that to other notions that are completely unrelated to that? And is this considered a masculine trait? Well, and then this is when you come into the issue of masculinity and femininity, and how much of that is just a thing we do that on average relates to certain people who are of certain identities, but that doesn't mean it's from that identity. I think that's the kind of distinction that I think has to be ironed out. So you can say like women are on average more likely to be nurturing, but that doesn't mean that a male can't be nurturing. It just means that they have a different curve for how often they're nurturing. So that doesn't really affect somebody's gender, because somebody can still be nurturing and say they're a male, but it's a feminine aspect, or at least considered a feminine aspect. So somebody could argue a woman that's nurturing, that plays into their gender, but I could just be like, well, no, they're just a nurturing person. There are plenty of women who aren't nurturing. There are plenty of men who are. So I almost think there's this walk of things that can be explained by gender. And then it's also like this conflation of gender, sex, masculinity, femininity. That is why the conversation is so convoluted. And I'm not saying this to undermine gender. I'm more saying this to undermine any hard points that could be made about it, if that makes sense. I think it's significantly more confusing. And then in the end, it's just one person has a bunch of feelings, and labeling them that attributed to their gender or masculinity or femininity or saying things like that is just odd and almost unnecessary. Maybe that's worth, I don't know. I'm leaving it there.
I think the way I would, or this is how I would respond. I think it's very, so what I heard you saying, and I guess you added the caveat, you're not necessarily dismissing gender here, but what I kind of heard you saying is the differences that we're seeing between people who call themselves men and people who call themselves women, or people who identify as men and people who identify as women. You could probably just cut out the men and women terminology and just say that's, you're focused that these people are looking at biological sex, they're looking at male and female, and that explains most of the differences that we see between the genders. And I guess what I would just say to that would be, then we have to explain what it is about gender, if we're skeptical that gender is even a thing, or gender is a helpful concept, then we have to speculate about why people are so attached to their concept of gender. Because again, I mean, most men, or most biological males, they're like, no, I'm a man. That they feel it deep in their core. It's same for most biological females. I am a woman to my, like, I am a woman to my core. It is who I am. It is what I am. The whole feminist movement is centered around the concept of womanhood. What does it mean to be a woman? I'm getting very theatrical here, but I don't think you can look at human life and just say that the differences. I think there are aspects which can't really be explained, or you're not really getting the full picture. You're kind of a person would be, I think, kind of taking a reductionist approach. If you just focus on sex and you don't look at other things that are going on here. The bedrock, as I said, is biological sex, but I think it goes beyond that. Just by we talked about this in a couple episodes. We talked about this a couple episodes ago. Human nature. I'll let you respond, and then I still needed to comment on the trans issue.
Okay, yeah, and we'll come back around to that part too. Okay, so hear me out, and this is me just like I don't get the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations because anybody I talk to is going to either agree with me or I can't have a conversation about any of these related things. So everything I'm saying after initial statements is thinking out loud. So I should preface it that way. But here's the thing: if biological sex is the bedrock of it, and we know that people tend to have an identity that they like to have, and we know that people are also like to have in-group preferences, and they like to have things to identify with, then there doesn't necessarily need to be that much more than I know a lot of people who also share the same struggles as I have because of my biological impulses, right? So a lot of men relate because of certain hormone related things. Like I watched this movie that's on Netflix that was super popular a few months ago, even though it came out like 5 years ago. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Knock Knock. Okay. The premise of the movie is Keanu Reeves is a great father. He's like the best father ever. And he stays home for the weekend to do work while his family goes on vacation. And then two stunning young women come up to his door when it's raining and pretty much say, "We're at the wrong house. We don't know where we are. Our phones are dead," because they're soaked in water. Yeah, the whole first 30 minutes of the movie is Keanu Reeves somehow avoiding cheating on his wife until, spoiler alert, he eventually cheats on his wife. And he does everything he could manage to not do. And the movies afterwards is him paying for cheating on his wife, pretty much. So any man who watches this movie, even though I don't think Acts 2 and 3 paid off, I think Act 1 is just beautiful because pretty much any guy who shares a certain amount of impulses and hormones would understand and relate and identify with Keanu Reeves' struggle. Now, am I identifying with, so here's the thing though, a lot of these impulses that are relatable don't have to be relatable on the macro to 100% of men for it to be a thing that is something you can defend as I guess a cornerstone of male culture or something of the sort. So a lot of men could watch it and identify with Keanu Reeves, but that doesn't mean if for some reason you don't identify with it or you don't think it's relatable, you're not a man. And if women put themselves in Keanu Reeves' shoes and maybe flip certain elements of it, they could also identify with things. So I guess the point I'm trying to get at is there are things with the cornerstone of biological sex where you can relate to certain struggles that people have based on that without having to add a second layer, which is gender, which is why I'm just skeptical of, I guess, at giving gender the unique level of importance and adding that there. And I'm not trying to, I guess I don't think it's integral that we dismiss gender, but it's just why I'm skeptical of it. Because I think there are easy ways for it based on biology for people to identify strongly with it without deciding that it's this translucent thing that can be described in potentially dozens of ways, if not hyper confounding ways. It's something that might easily be entangled by biological impulses or something of the sort. And now people have drastically different biology, and maybe that could be an argument of why it can be more complex. But it's one of those things where I'm just trying to get out there that I'm just not necessarily convinced that adding the layer of gender versus sex is particularly helpful, because I could identify with Keanu Reeves there, not because we both think we're men, but because we share a lot of impulses as biological males. That's what it seemed like as I watched the film. Now, okay, I was going to open up another can of worms, but I shouldn't. You can respond to that however you want and transition to the next topic, because using some of these terms, well, one, I have to keep myself on track to use male and female and man and woman differently. So I'm just trying to not stumble upon myself in too many contradictions, but in my head it's making sense. So yeah, you could take over.
I mean, I guess I understand where you're coming from, and I can sympathize with what you're saying at some level. But I just keep coming back to, and maybe like this is just maybe this is a symptom of ignorance on my part, or just on the part of people as a whole. Maybe 300 years in the future or something, people will have like figured out what's going on here, and like they're able to explain it in a way that you and I can't because of our lack of understanding. But there's just something, and it sounds so anthropocentric, but I can't get away from it. I mean, there's just something about humans that makes everything way more complicated than than a bee colony, than a pack of wolves. I mean, chimpanzees, a family of chimpanzees. I mean, you can. Let me finish really quickly. Like that's not to say that there aren't complexities within nature, and that humans are the only complex thing in the universe. Of course not. But we are just so far more complex than any of those other things that I don't think you can get away from. I don't think you can get away from some of these concepts, which someone might say, "Oh, it doesn't make sense." Or hold on, I'm stuttering. What I'm trying to say is, I think I'm still holding on to something like the concept of gender, because I just think to be a human being is to be something very different than to be anything else in the animal, in the living world, in the universe, really. So like it's not really. I don't see an issue with like, okay, gender's complicated. People don't define it. People are sloppy in their definitions of it. So I'm just gonna. I don't think you can. There's just certain aspects of human nature, or just like what it means to be a human being, that you really can't simplify. And again, maybe that goes back to lack of knowledge. But at this point, you can't really simplify them based on our understanding. It just goes back to my earlier point, which is people's intense attachment to these ideas. You have to explain that somehow. And I think the best explanation is there's something about the human mind, there's something about the brain that creates these feelings for people to be like, I'm a man, I'm a woman, and so on and so on. I'll let you respond, and then we really need to tackle, or I really need to give my opinion on my trans comrades. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that although animals don't really experience consciousness in the way we do, there are like lots of very unique hierarchies that involve sex in certain animal kingdoms, where certain male animals will become subservient to other male animals in certain hierarchies. And if somebody was going to anthropomorphize them, they would actually probably use a lot of our language that is more common in I would say our types of way of describing gender. And if somebody wanted to anthropomorphize them, they could. The animals just can't, because they don't have consciousness. I was just going to throw that out there because I think that's interesting to think about. And isn't that the thing with seahorses, where seahorses are able to change from male to female over their life, something like that. But the other thing I was going to say was, I think, and maybe, and this will be relevant as we move into the other part of the conversation. But one of the reasons why I think I have such objections maybe to a lot of the thinking here is because I think it overgeneralizes. So I think your critique is, it's easy to generalize it to just two genders, and I think my critique is to make a lot of decisions about how somebody identifies. They have to make generalizations about individuals within a group in a way that I don't think is fair to do. So, like, if you imagined like a chart, or some kind of graph that showed how average, like if you're able to measure caring, right? Like how much somebody is caring about other individuals in their life. You might have a normal distribution for men that's like here, and it's like, oh, look, on average, they top out at like 7, and most people fall between 4 and 6. And then the women one might just be a similar shaped curve, but just one over. So you have a whole area where they overlap to some degree, but it's just on average, the curve is different. And that's what I think a lot of things that come down to when people talk about being a man or a woman in society, and a lot of things that's like, oh, well, we polled women and women tend to care more about this issue. I think it's just because they have there are curves on a line about whatever shapes these views, and it's 2 points over one way, 2 points over another way. So I think when people make generalizations to shape their identity in ways, I think they end up having to make generalizations about these groups that have a whole distribution on each characteristic. And I think that's one of the things that I push back on so much. It's really saying, I'm going to take the Platonic idea of this, an abstraction based on all these averages we're aware of, and then we're going to compare someone's experience to what they predict this Platonic person in our society would be. And that just seems very, I guess, odd and generalized. And I'm against, and I always give a hard time to generalizations. Like when we talk about workers, somebody will say something's pro-worker, and I'm like, well, it's not pro-worker for the 10% of the workers it alienates. It's good for 90% of workers, right? So that's just kind of thing I'm known to push back on. So maybe that's my sticking point with things. And I think that ties into where we're going to go with talking about transgenderism. So yeah.
I mean, we agree on so much, so I'm trying to find the way to square this circle. I mean, I agree that I agree that, like, if we say that men are usually high in disagreeableness, I'm not like, that's not to say that men can never be agreeable. I for one am very high in agreeableness, and I consider myself a man, so there's the proof in the pudding of that. And then I agree that that there are complexities within the social structure of other animals as well. I'm not saying that there isn't complexity there, but humans, for some reason, I think, are just way more complex. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned consciousness, but that's part of it. So okay, but to tie it back to what I wanted to talk about for a little bit, it's the issue of like gender identity, or more specifically, people who are born male or female, and they feel that they should have been born in another body, and so they generally socially and medically, or not, some of them, some people socially and medically transition in that scenario. It's called gender dysphoria. And so I guess some people want to say, well, okay, how do we explain that? There are kind of different ideas. Some people are like, oh, then some people say, if you're a woman, if you identify as a woman, then you're a woman. Others are like, no, 2 genders, period. That's like the simplistic way of explaining the kind of the 2 major sides of that debate. I guess before I say that, I should probably bring up a broader point, or bring up something else very specifically to connect to that point. So I was making the argument that we have to, like, that I was kind of saying at some level, well, gender's true, or has to be true to a certain extent, because people attach to it so strongly. And I had a thought in my head that an audience member might be having right now, so I wanted to squish that thought. There's another human category, you mentioned it earlier, that people feel very attached to, and that's race. And so, and I guess I bring this up, I just want to quickly, like, kind of compare and contrast, I guess, these concepts quickly, as a way to think more deeply on the trans on the trans experience. I think, if I understand the science correctly, the reason I would say that gender is far greater a far stronger concept, a far more provable or a provable category, or a far more exact category than race is. It goes back to kind of the brain. So and I guess maybe here you could say, well, then this goes back to just male versus female, Matthew. But I guess I would say they're the studies, neurologists and neuroscientists have shown that men and women, males and females, they have different brain structures. That their brains are not exactly the same. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying about the certain distinctions or differences we say between men and women. That they go back to biology. At least some of them do to an extent because of these differences in brain structures. And as far as I know, there's no difference in brain structures across the races. But so that kind of gets into, I guess, the trans experience. Because there's also studies that show that, say, trans women, for example, if you look at their brain, they have a brain that's more similar to a female brain than a male brain, which is very interesting. Of course, it has to do partly with hormones. I mean, and that's another thing. It's like, well, how do we define men and women or males and females? It's like part of it also goes back to hormones. And the hormones change the brain structure in certain ways, which might account for certain generalizations which you can make, which aren't always true, but sometimes are relevant, at least, when we're talking about differences between men and women in terms of certain character traits or whatnot. So due to studies like that seem to indicate that trans people have a brain more similar to their desired, or the gender that they feel like they are. And because of, again, I think the gender's more, the gender's greater connection to biological facts that we can determine. That's why I come down to the conclusion, really, that someone who identifies as a trans man or a trans woman is not mentally ill, is not looking for attention or just crazy or whatever. They're experiencing something. They're experiencing just a variation among of the human experience. I can't quite relate to it. I mean, because I'm not trans. So I can't speak to it from personal experience, but and I guess to add to this, to add to what I'm saying. So putting all that together, I guess I just don't see. I can't see myself saying that that their identity is that they're wrong in their identity, or their identity is irrelevant. And I mean, and okay, so there's so much to talk about here, and I'm not trying to hog the mic, but so I guess, but and then we also get to just like kind of things like social norms and like politeness and manners and whatnot. Because so in that sense, it's like, well, if someone introduces themselves, so it's a trans woman, they say, hi, I'm Emily, she, her, hers pronouns. Like, okay, I'm going to call her Emily, say she, her, hers. Just, out of politeness for her, out of politeness for, in order to not, offend her, not to bother her and whatnot. I'm just going to, I would do that for, interpersonal reasons. I mean, even if someone like, and that goes back to other kinds of other genders as well. Someone, they, them, or gender fluid, or has different kinds of pronouns. I'll use them. But this is, I guess, my final point on this. The issue, I guess, for me does come when we start expanding and we start talking about gender fluid or gender queer or bigender or agender, or demigender, or these various terms, because we do seem to be, or the culture seems to be fragmenting and creating more and more boxes and more labels, which of course is kind of interesting from a cultural perspective. But so like I can't say, so like you're suspicious of your skepticism about just the whole concept of gender. I guess my skepticism comes in when at the periphery with, again, things like gender queer, gender or fluid and things like that. But I think, again, I think we have to understand why people feel this way. We have to talk to them. We have to, kind of get them to explain this to us. And we just have to try to think about it as, and this is difficult, of course, as impartially as we can. We try to suspend our judgments, our prejudices, try to suspend other people's prejudices, and just try to think about, okay, if someone identifies as genderqueer, what's going on here? What does that mean? If someone identifies as trans, again, what is going on here? What does that mean? We need to first, this is a sappy point, I know. You could have this on cable television. You could have me on cable television saying this. You have to first empathize with the person's experience and understand the person's experience, in order to get to any concept of truth, that big word we always use in quotation marks on the podcast, truth, when it comes to concepts like gender. So that was a big rant, but I had a lot to say. So take it, the conversation in whatever direction you see fit.
Should I be okay with taking the conversation in the direction that is most likely to get me in trouble? Is that where I should go with it?
You can take it wherever you want. I'm not.
Okay. So because what you kind of laid out there was kind of like why you kind of are operating from it's valid and here's why things are valid. And I guess I have an unanswerable question, and this isn't even what I want to delve in on. I'm going to change the topic in 10 seconds, but I still am stuck on if the whole discussion about gender is based on heuristics and stereotypes about people on genders. So it's like if somebody, and then it's heuristics about masculinity and femininity. And I think that, so it seems like to me the whole conversation's root is what is something that I think is just based on collectivist impulses that I think are invalid. And I think it's human instinct to draw these things, but I think this is an error of the brain, and then somebody making a life decision about how they want people to interact with them and how they feel about themselves based on generalizations about that they want to make these generalizations and then apply them to themselves and then have people treat them a certain way, and they want to, because they feel that they are a certain type of person. So in the end, I think where it comes into play, and this is where I'm going to take it to the potentially dangerous direction, is when I found myself jotting down kind of sentences and thoughts, and I'm like, okay, I think this is half of a point. Maybe I can bring this into something. I wrote down the question, when is gender even useful? And the reason I thought about that, and I guess because we want to be as contentious as possible, I have to bring up race again. So I live in North Philadelphia, and statistically, if I'm walking to my apartment, which is a ways off campus beyond where students want to live, and I still live by a college, if I'm walking home and it's 12:30 at night, and there is a white girl who looks like she's my age, just statistically, I'm much less likely to be a victim of any crime she could commit to me than if it was a guy who was my height and had a darker skin color, because that probably means he's not a student based on the area. And then, well, I'm in a low income area. So even though I don't think he is acting in that way because of his skin color, I can use skin color, height, gender as heuristics. So now most of the time though, I don't care what the gender is on who I'm talking to, because most of the time I talk to people I know pretty well. So you have to think of, okay, well, when is gender useful? Well, gender is useful when I'm talking to somebody I don't know and need to make judgments about what I should do and what is the best course of action on what to do. Okay. So it's like saying there are certain types of jokes I could say in front of a person who presents themselves as a male, and it'll be fine 85% of the time. But just given based on what I know about a lot of women my age, that might only fly 30% of the time. So it's like, okay, well, that's a judgment I would make based on a heuristic because I don't know the individual very, very well. That's a time where, somebody's appearance in terms of gender could be useful. But then I'd combine that with like a million other indicators, like if a girl looks like an art student versus if a girl looks like a business school student, I might think the art student is going to have different, maybe a more overt political leanings or something like that. So there are all these things to use to make judgments off people. What I'm getting at here is the crux and the most controversial flashpoint of the transgender issue is the external aspect. It's not the important part, and the reason why it's in the public discourse isn't because it matters how they identify to themselves. It's how they want other people to treat them based on how they personally identify. So if somebody decides that they, for whatever reason, feel like they were born into the wrong body and they want to be treated as a woman, the reason why it's such a flashpoint issue is because there's this like virulent sentiment that they either must be treated in the way that they're asking, or else it is offense beyond comprehension, right? You're denying their existence because you're not treating them. And these are the talking points, and I'm caricaturing it to some extent because that's the dramatic social justice wing talking points, right? You're denying their existence. You're not treating them as how they wish to be identified. So what I'm getting at is like kind of steering the conversation towards why is it so important for someone to call, say, a transgender girl just a girl without any qualification? Because there's been something I've said which ends up being controversial, and I think it's pretty neutral. And then it's that like I don't mind, you mentioned it in pleasantries. I don't give a I almost I managed to not say any swear words on this podcast for a long time, and I almost just dropped one so colloquially. But I do not care what somebody identifies with. If I don't know and just hang it out, it's like, you want me to call you she, and I accidentally used the wrong one. Oh, okay, my bad. I didn't mean to offend you, unless for some reason I really wanted to offend that person. But generally, I don't mean to offend. I'll call people whatever they want to be called. But it's not just that I'm willing to do it. It's that in my brain, it is a very important thing for people to know that I don't just recognize that person by saying their pronouns, but they want people like me to say unequivocally that person is a female or a woman in the same way that a biological female, or my mom, as an example, in the same way that my mom is. And it's not okay to take this, well, what I see is a nuanced position of saying, well, I'll be nice to them, but I still think there's, say, a distinction between a transgender female or a transgender girl and like a biological girl. So in my mind, and this is, we've attempted this discussion maybe a year and a half ago, something similar to it, and kind of hit bad roadblocks. But one thing that I've said, because you kind of pressed me on it, was if I think a transgender, a male to female transgender person is a woman, and I'm kind of like, well, they're a transgender woman. So like their lived experience is different than a biological woman. Because they're a transgender woman, they're most likely not going to be treated like a woman by most people. So their lived experience, even in the moment once they transition, is still closer to a subset than it is the general. And then they aren't biologically a man. And then it comes to my interactions with them, their gender almost never matters because most people's gender doesn't even really matter. So it's kind of like I would just be conservative about the way I define the group, and I would just carve them out as a trans woman. But I feel like that is an objectionable thing to say because I'm not affirming their existence as just simply a woman. And it's because I'm saying, well, it's clearly different because that's why they had to transition. And that makes me not an ally, and that makes me like a pariah. And I don't think I could say that in a corporate setting without getting reprimanded for it. Like that's not an acceptable opinion anymore in terms of really what you're allowed to say in like any type of professional setting, or even to like have publicly hold that position. But I think that's the most nuanced and the most descriptive. So I that's a roadblock I'm really stumbling over when I think about this. So I don't know. I think there is a criticism of what I just said, and you could just say, well, because in the end, even though I'm choosing to use those words, in the end, I'm not affirming they're a woman, which is what the problem is. And it's like, well, that's kind of true. But I still think that's the most correct. I have another half of a point, but I think it's probably better to wrap up because it's kind of cynical. But so I'll leave that for discussion's sake.
I mean, if we can distinguish between like, and here I am generalizing again, normal people and social justice warriors, and they're not the same thing. Most people are not social justice warriors unless you're on the left, unless you're on Twitter and other social media platforms. Then it's like, okay, everyone seems like a social justice warrior. But from what I understand, and from what I've like the YouTube videos I've seen and the articles I've read on the matter, like trans women or trans men, they're more than happy to say like, yeah, no, I don't have the same experience as a the term is cisgendered woman or a cisgendered man. They're more than happy to say like, no, I'm not exactly the same. I guess the contention or the sticking point comes in again with the term man or woman. I don't know why I keep using trans woman. I can use trans man just as easily. A trans man isn't saying, at least a good portion of them that I think they're not saying, or at least we need to be going back to generalizations. We need to be careful about like nuances. I don't think like all trans men are going to be like, yeah, if you don't think of this, I'm the same as a biological man, then you're a terrible human being. I think they say, yeah, I'm different than a biological man, but you should still like I'm still a man. I guess is kind of what they would say. Or like so, and it goes back to, I guess, at least from my perspective, again, the internal aspects of it and the identity built. So because if someone, again, if someone's born a physical anatomical female and they start growing up and they feel themselves to be a man, I think, and they physically or they medically and socially transition. They were born Jennifer and now they're George. I don't see why I should dismiss their feelings in that scenario, or why I should, and I don't see why it's like controversial necessarily for me to say, oh, that's a man. It's not the same as he's not the same as me because he wasn't born biological male, but I'm still going to say he's a man because that's part of his mental landscape, and I'm willing to make room for his mental landscape because I mean not just out of politeness, but because I mean at some level, I think we all want a society where, or most people want a society where everyone is allowed to be themselves or feel like they have the opportunity and the freedom to express themselves, and just to kind of do stuff they want to do and be the person that they feel themselves to be. I mean, it goes back, we haven't even brought up this topic, but it goes back to sexuality, I mean, it's like, and that's, of course, sexuality and gender are not the same thing, of course, but I mean, I want to live in a society where where a lesbian can, be out and about and with her girlfriend, and it doesn't matter, like, and nobody cares because it doesn't matter and nobody needs to care. So I see the gender issue the same way I see the sexuality issue. It's to some degree we treat people, I mean the cliche, treat people the way you want to be treated. People want to be seen as who they think they are, and sometimes there's a disconnect, and that's you mentioned that in the very first part of the podcast. But I think that doesn't. I don't think that's necessarily relevant in this context. But I guess I would just add, at the end of the day, we don't have to quibble about like here's the thing. I guess it's at some level. I mean, I can make a philosophical argument about gender, and I guess I kind of was doing that in the first half of this podcast. But a couple episodes ago, I was kind of questioning the relevance of philosophy, as I do now and then. And so at some level, it's like, well, okay, like I'm not really gonna, like I don't have to really think that much about, I don't have to think that deeply about gender at some level, because it's okay if someone identifies as a man, I'm gonna view them as a man. If someone identifies as a woman, I'm gonna think of them as a woman. Um, you know, and I say that genuinely. I'm not going to be like, I'm not saying like, oh, some crazy, 62-year-old psychopath identifies as a woman so he can go into the woman's restroom or whatever. Like I'm obviously that's a anomaly. That's an extreme example of someone maliciously trying to do something. So at the end of the day, I guess is what I'm trying to say is, you could almost say like, it doesn't matter this conversation. I mean, not this conversation particularly, but just conversations about this, or like having long debates about these terms. I mean, people are people. And I live in a particular society that kind of functions a certain way. And I guess I'll do that to some degree. You can't get, I guess what I'm kind of making. So I'm making like a Foucault-esque point at some level. Like I'm stuck in my own culture here. And so I'm just kind of going to do, I'm going to do this because this is just kind of how people around me are behaving. Maybe it's not philosophically true. Maybe it's not true in the Platonic sense, but it works in this scenario. So
Yeah, I think my sticking points, since we're kind of just talking about sticking points a little bit here, is just when like you describe the person who you treat in a nice way, it'd be because you respect how their self-valuation of identity. But I think my sticking point ends up being that if somebody says that they feel like they're a man or feel like they're a woman, I just feel like that sentence is a sentence that doesn't, it can be interpreted in meaning a million ways. You can feel like you're a woman because you worked hard, dedicated your whole life to things you believe in, and you're one of the most successful business people in the world, because that's what like Oprah did. You could also feel like a woman because you stayed at home and you want to be a homemaker that that nurtures children, and you want to educate them, make them great people so they can do things with their lives, and you want to you want to evoke the nuclear family. So when somebody, a lot of times it's just such a nebulous thing, because we're trying to envelop every people. Well, we're trying to envelop common elements from widely disparate people who share small categories, and then use it to create like a Platonic definition of woman. But anybody can come up with a different Platonic definition of woman and then say that's what they feel more like, because they don't like who they are as a man, and then say, I feel like I am this. And I don't think that's something that's necessarily wrong to do. I just feel like it's so, and I'm not saying it's wrong because it's subjective, but I'm saying it's just so subjective and based in just it's not even artificial, but it's just based in the whole, this is what I feel like makes a woman, and that's what I am, and I feel like I would feel better about myself if I pursue this. And now I want people to say that I'm a like that so and so is a woman because that's their chosen identity. And then it just doesn't have any big picture basis that I find satisfying. So in the end, like, it's not that I think these people are deeply mentally ill, like Ben Shapiro would say, but I just don't think it makes sense. Because I think you have to use heuristics and stereotypes and collectivist tropes that in our brain is ready made for heuristics and collectivism. That's why it's so natural and easy for us to do all the time without realizing it when we make sweeping generalizations. But I think the logic of putting yourself in that position of, I do not identify with what I am right now, and this is what I'd like to be. I'm not saying they're wrong for thinking that, but I'm saying there is no rational underpinning for it. Even if it makes a person better off, I'm fine with saying like, yeah, that's awesome. You should live your life. People should live their life. but I just don't see a rational underpinning there. Now, this flows into a point I wanted to make that is somewhat controversial, but very interesting, I think. And this comes down to, Jonathan Haidt's work on the righteous mind. Okay. So he wrote a book that's all about people's moral foundations, and then he ties how people test on moral foundations to their political affiliations. And he kind of used that to describe vaguely the political polarization and, kind of to escape that out. And it's a really interesting book. One thing that conservatives or Republicans tend to score very high on is it's disgust and repulsion. And you could probably guess where I'm going with this. The other key thing to Jonathan Haidt's work is how people post hoc rationalize things. So there are studies where you take somebody who's for and against gun control, you give them both the same statistics, and they both find a way to make their case using the same statistics. And sometimes people would intentionally do math wrong to make their point, even though they're people who are very educated. So a lot of this, like we can say all of this stuff, and I think I am making genuine rational points, and I think you definitely have convinced yourself of whatever your views are, which is fine. I mean, I'm still not convinced, but you're also not convinced by me, so it goes both ways. Now, in the end, it could very simply be Jonathan Haidt's test on disgust and repulsion. So so if I see a person who is telling me that they're a woman, and I have many times, and a lot of people have nowadays, seen a person who you can tell wants to be addressed as a female, who looks nothing like a female, and it's a biological man, and it gives you incredible discomfort for a lot of reasons. If somebody has a higher repulsion factor towards that, you can see how they see all these conversations as non-starters. And that's why, even though I think we reached an okay level of discourse and made some ground and had some good back and forth, I am concerned that both of what we just said is an outgrowth of our post hoc rationalizations in terms of being comfortable with men presenting themselves as females and vice versa. And I think a lot of this comes down to things as mundane as evolutionary biology, because I could understand somebody's reptilian brain going, oh, I thought that was a person who could reproduce, and they have fooled me, and they have the parts that are male parts. And then this triggers, like, you can imagine if you put a random 30-year-old on 4chan and they thought they were looking at a GIF of a very attractive girl, only to be surprised by a certain elements of genitalia, you would know that if you test that person's brain, many of them would feel repulsed. And I'm not using that in an exaggerating circumstance. I'm just being really honest. And this is an intuition you can't escape. This is the same reason why you have people who call people fat phobic. And if you ask a person who is not attracted to an overweight woman, they will have a very hard time explaining to you in a rational way why they are not attracted to an overweight woman. And then somebody can come in and say, well, from an evolutionary perspective, you can argue that these people look unhealthy. And if somebody looks unhealthy or they have these things that are off, then they don't seem unattractive. So I guess I'm just laying all this out because this is something I was aware of when I was thinking about this issue, for the last day, really leading up to it, just trying to put my thoughts into words. I think a lot of things I'm saying are valid. And I think a lot of things you're saying are valid, or at least are valid to ourselves. But I'm also very aware that a lot of things may very well just be post hoc rationalizations to our level of disgust with things. And I've heard older people pretty much say this without hesitation because they don't think it's offensive to say it. But younger people have to pseudo intellectualize it because certain things you can't say. So I wanted to at least put that out there because I think that's one of the elephants in the room in the whole conversation. Because and that's one of the truly offensive things to say now. And this is the other thing that people can get in trouble for. Is a man who's heterosexual could be transphobic if they would not be interested in a male to female transgender person. That's a thing that some people say. It's not a popular thing to say. A lot of people that say that would be interpreted as social justice warrior types, but it comes down to these basic instincts. And maybe to some degree, instincts shouldn't necessarily be things that need to be rationalized. And I kind of reject that, but like this one, I've referenced honor culture before. Like I do kind of think it's not an immoral thing to say, get revenge. Like if somebody deeply screwed you over and you decided to get vengeance on them, even if people can say, well, you're only adding more evil to a world, an eye for an eye isn't really a moral thing. It's like I can imagine a universe like if you watch John Wick, where a guy's revenge isn't necessarily immoral. So it's I think it comes down to a lot of these weird intuitions and then post hoc rationalizations. So I am really weary of that, but I also think the real discourse can go beyond me putting up two fingers and you saying talking points. So I do think we did make some ground, but I think that's something I wanted to tie in.
So, you said a lot. I won't respond to all of it, of course. Um, I mean, I guess there's a couple things I could say to wrap up my point. And I'll give you the final word. So, when you bring up, you have a tendency to bring up, or in our conversations, collectivist thinking or collectivist interpretations of the world. And you mentioned how that your issue with generalizations. Now I have a similar, I have a similar tendency. If someone makes a generalization or just makes a very big statement. So like if someone says, this is the best novel of my generation, or things like that, very big statements. My mind's like, well, is that really true? And it's similar for generalizations. So I guess I'm saying I can I can relate to you on that level. Like, yeah, if someone says generalization, my mind's like, are there exceptions to that though? But I guess maybe the difference then, I think that's a bad. I think we need to, or I guess what I would say is, it's not very helpful to put collectivist on it. I don't think, or at the very least, I just think sometimes generalizations are helpful, and all you have to do is acknowledge that sometimes they might not be true. But that's not to say there's not something to a generalization. So again, I mean, the most people in prison are men. That's not now. There are women in prison. There are women who've done terrible things. There are women who've committed worse crimes than certain men have. That's true. So that's not a generalization that's like true for all time in the Platonic sense, like you're saying. But it is true, and it's helpful to think about when we're thinking about at least if I'm putting it in your language, the difference between males and females, or at least the way that males and females are interacting in society, or the way that males and females are getting how if they're thriving or not thriving in society, and what that says about our society. So we can look at it purely from a cultural relativistic we can look at it through the lens of cultural relativism, and just think throw biology out the window at that point. But it's like, okay, more men are in prison than women. It's like, or more males are in prison than females. It's like, okay, we can look at that and kind of think about it. So that's one example. When you bring up the term collectivist in that context, that's just something that totally flies over my head. And then the other thing I wanted to say, so I learned about, so recently I'm a college student, if anyone didn't realize that. And I took a cultural anthropology class not too long ago, and I learned about something very interesting. I learned about this group of people called the Sworn Virgins of Albania. Now, if anyone knows anything about Albania, it's that people think of it as one of the most backwards countries in all of Europe. And in Albania, away from the cities, there are these small mountainous. There are these small kind of towns in this mountainous areas of Albania. Again, far away from the city. And in these small little mountain towns, there are these biological females that generally, like, they felt something wrong, like, with their lives at a very strong age, or very young age, excuse me. They're very strong feeling about, something about my life just isn't right. I don't really like what's going on here. And then they get to a certain age and they're just like, okay, I'm going to be a man. And you know what they do? They take on all the rights, or they take on all the responsibilities of the men, and they're given all the rights that men are given. They're even allowed to smoke and drink and socialize with the men. And women aren't allowed to do that in these small little mountainous towns. And all they have to do is they have to forego getting married. They have to forego having sex and having children. That's why they're called the sworn virgins of Albania. But the whole community, no, they're just men at that point. It doesn't matter. Like that's how that's how this community kind of functions. And that makes the most sense. You talk about, you feel like you're making rational arguments. I also feel like I'm making rational arguments, like you said. And that I think is a good example, I think, for why I'm making a rational argument. You could say that's just one example of a weird country doing a weird thing, and maybe, but I mean, I think it's at least, it contrasts from what we are struggling with now with people in this, like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder. It's like, no, it's two genders. You're never going to change my mind. It's like, okay, but then you have the sworn virgins of Albania, and I'm just like, I think we should at least raise the question, like, okay, there's these two very conflicting worldviews. And I think we have to, I think, at least acknowledge that maybe ours, maybe the idea of like the two genders or two sexes, that's it. Maybe that's not correct. Maybe mine isn't correct either. That's something else. That's something I need to think about. But that example of that something happening in a foreign country, I think, gives one reason to think about these questions further. I will not comment in this current episode about the things about like post hoc rationalization and different personality traits and whatnot, causing people to have different political views, because that could be a conversation for a whole other episode.
So I kind of want to jump into. I think you're raising a really awesome. So the whole post hoc rationalization thing is a meta point, right? I bring that up to just bring up thinking about things, and it works in the context of the issue, and I tied it in. I think I want to bring up another meta point, because it's the point you just brought up about the women and the sworn virgins of Albania. I think brings up the meta point of how anytime you show people news articles, a lot of times they read in exactly what they want to read into it. So as you're explaining that example, I don't see that as the sworn virgins of Albania are now men. I read it as, wow, Albania is this terrible place that if a woman wants to have the rights of men, they have to strip themselves of certain privileges. It doesn't turn them into men. They're just women who have made certain sacrifices that are bad. And now people treat them differently, but they're still not a man because they're not allowed to get married and have sex, and they're this different category. If anything, if I was to write a book and there was going to be a chapter on transgenderism, I would use that example maybe to bolster the points I made earlier about how a female to male trans person should be considered its own class, separate from both males and females, and should specifically be this group that has transitioned. So I think that, like, if Ben Shapiro knew that example, he could read it and have a light bulb moment, and he could use that to further his own argument and not even remotely get any nearer to the arguments you'd put forward. And I think this is just both issue of human cognition, and it's also just the way that people will define gender so differently. And I think what this conversation illustrated is, even though we were able to make certain points of understanding with each other beyond maybe what I expected, we still couldn't nail down what either of these things mean. And I think it's because of the generalization issue. And there are times to generalize and times to not generalize. I agree with that. But I think the issue is, so one of the issues I have right now when I talk about economics is a trope right now is how Black people are super hurt by coronavirus in terms of economically. And the reason is because Black people disproportionately have a lot of in-person service jobs compared to other demographic groups. So any minorities, people of color, have an outside proportion of service jobs, and those are the industries that most been hurt, is like service and hospitality. Well, the thing is, there's still a huge segment of white people who got hurt in services and hospitalities. But when I listen to NPR, all they want to talk about is the people of color who were hurt there. But the thing is, they'll bother specifying, we want to talk about people of color that worked in these industries, when you could just include all people in those industries, because all people in those industries got hurt. But instead, they're picking out people of color and that industry when they could easily make it more inclusive. So a lot of conversations about, say, gender, and I'm critiquing the fact that we're deciding to generalize certain feminine or masculine characteristics. Like somebody could say men watch sports, but in the end, a ton of men don't watch sports and a ton of women do watch sports. So it's like, is it beneficial to say the phrase men watch sports? It's like, yeah, it's an okay generalization, but it's also imprecise. So I feel like a lot of the generalizations we might be using in this conversation aren't wrong, just like saying men watch sports, but it's imprecise in describing the whole picture. And that's why I think if I am trying to be use reason about this issue, I think a lot of things are intentionally imprecise, because if you're not willing to make generalizations, then you draw nuances that lead to, well, anybody of any gender can really have any stance. So there's no reason why these things need to be gendered. But when somebody carves together an identity based around gender, you can gender it if you want to. That's where I think the issue things fall apart on the generalization side. So it's not necessarily that it's wrong. I just think it's incomplete and imprecise most of the time.
So, I need to think a bit more about what you said for a second.
I do think we covered a lot here, and I have no idea when we start recording, but this is definitely already on territory to be at least like one of the longer ones in the last dozen episodes. I'm pretty sure. So if any the people who've listened through to this point have gotten a lot to chew on, even if some of it they find distasteful. We've covered such a wide range of stuff that I think it was more substantive than I expected, especially because of how many ways you can take different things. So you can get a last word in and wrap up, and I'd be okay with that, because I don't know how much runway we got left.
Alrighty. Well, so I brought up the Sworn Virgins of Albania. I guess just as the counterpoint to the BoomerCon attitude towards the trans issue.
I don't think that's a counterpoint, though. That's what I was trying to say.
No.
Ben Shapiro could hear that and be like, that's not a counterpoint.
It is a counterpoint. It is a counterpoint, I think, because it is a difference between people saying, okay, if you're born, it's the difference between saying, you are bound by your biological sex and you're not bound by your biological sex in terms of how people are going to treat you. That's, or at least it's more flexible in the Sworn Virgins of Albania. There's a bit more flexibility in that culture's attitude towards this than ours is, because people still have the conversation, because people still can't agree on whether trans women are women and whether trans men are men. But this culture, this little, these mountainous towns, rural towns, like they're just, if the woman identifies as a woman and does man things or things they think are man things, then nope, he's a man now. Like that. So that's all I'm saying. It's a matter of. No, actually, I made my point clear. I don't need to add to that.
Okay, so if Ben Shapiro was here, though, you know what he would say, and all he would say is they're treating them differently, but it's even more signifying that these women were penalized and had to make these sacrifices so they could get privileges of men.
Well,
He would clarify that there's no reason to think that makes them a man. He's like, they're still biologically a woman. They just obtained the rights of men and are treated as men. But why would that make them a man? They are specifically women, which is why they have to swear these oaths to be treated in a way that's different. So he'd probably say, if anything, it's showing the divide. Like to even be treated in that way, you have to make these obscene sacrifices because they're women. That's what Ben Shapiro's counterpoint would be. And then. Yeah, I understand the distinction you're making, but I'm saying a BoomerCon would not remotely feel like they've been, corrected It would just be like, yeah, okay, that's weird, but it doesn't change anything.
I don't think I'm explaining myself properly, because I'm not saying that doesn't even necessarily make them men. I'm saying that's a culture with a different attitude on the matter. That's all I'm saying. It was my way of bringing up a different way to think about gender and sex than the BoomerCon alternative, and that was the main reason I brought it up. So you can say, fine, the sworn virgins of Albania, they're not men, but that's not what the people in that culture think, and I'm just making that point. People in that culture don't think like that at all, and Ben Shapiro can say they're wrong, and that's fine. But it is. That's why we're having this conversation, right? I mean, even though I said at some level it might be irrelevant to have these conversations, but I guess to argue against myself here, it's not irrelevant, because our culture has certain views on gender and sex, and so I think it's important for us to look at other cultures' views on gender and sex, and then we can come to the conclusion, which culture we think has a more rational or more humane attitude on these matters. So that is why I brought up the sworn virgins of Albania. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about it compared to the boomer cons. Okay, I'm fine with that. I thought you were saying like, hey, this is like like potentially a rebuttal to what they have to say, and it's more of a rebuttal to maybe their worldview. But I think they would still say to those Albanians that treat the sworn virgins as or consider them literally men. I think he would say the same thing to them as he would say to the social justice warriors that think a trans woman is a woman.
Well, and it's totally voluntary. It's totally voluntary, by the way. These women, it's like, no, I don't want to marry. I don't want to have children. I don't want to have I don't want to do the womanly things. I want to forego those things in order to work on the farm and smoke cigars with the guys on Friday nights. Like they're not being coerced. No one's saying you have to do this.
Well, you are forced into a false choice, right? Because you can't you can't work on the farm and still have sex or still have a relationship. So it's still a forced choice, and I'd say that's still really wrong and backwards. And I think you'd agree. You shouldn't have to pick one or the other. You should be able to work on the farm and then still, have what other preferences you have.
Oh no! Well, you don't. Again, I'm not. You don't have to defend. You don't have to defend every aspect of this to say that. It's not necessarily. It's not just, or it's not as simple as like saying, at least in many cases, it's not. You can't say, oh, these women are being forced to give up all that stuff and pretend to be men, when most of these women wanted to do this from a very early age, and that's why they did it. Now there were other aspects. I mean, well, no, I was going to say something that would probably muddy the issue. I mean, to give a little bit extra context, if you really want it, there probably were. I think there were some examples in the article I read about some examples of some sworn virgins being a bit more, the family being a bit more involved in the decision. So it's not perfectly black and white. But I did want to make clear, at least for a good portion of them, again, to generalize, it's not about coercive institutions or society corrupting people until their lives are just complete lies. It's a matter of like, oh, I was born a female, but I don't want to be a woman. So I'm going to be a man, and the whole society is going to accept that, and that's fine.
Yeah. I think it does raise the interesting, the example, it raises the meta point I kind of touched on of, because the society decided to treat them as a man. So for all intents and purposes, they were a man, which is kind of what you were getting at. And that's the framing you liked. But then that kind of raises the, what's the term for that? When you flip the script on it, the inverse scenario of, in our society, you can imagine somebody saying they're trans, and then if everybody just kept calling them a dude anyways, the fact that nobody recognizes it, does that make them not? And then we'd probably say, well, no, they still are. So how much of the legitimacy, I guess, well, one of the things that I find intriguing and I guess this is maybe unnecessary to hone in on because we should probably wrap up. But it comes down to how important it is that other people accept the first person's self-determination. So whatever, and this is why it's such a controversial thing. And it's because it has the recognition of somebody's self-identification is almost what gives it legitimacy, or else it wouldn't be such a big deal that people were, tough on it. And it's like, well, no, because it makes people feel bad, and then it makes them question if they actually really are that, because nobody's willing to recognize that they are one. So it makes the issue lack nuance without being without it being you run in danger of being offensive if you have any nuance about it. Because I think even you would be willing to recognize that not everybody who thinks that they're a transgender person is a transgender person, only because some of those people are like 3 years old or 5 years old. And if a 3-year-old said that, you would probably give that different consideration than a 27-year-old. So it's like so to some degree, not every case of somebody's self-identification is as legitimate as everybody else's case. But then to some degree, they care about what other people say, or else it wouldn't be something that would merit deep, reactions when people push back on it. So I think there's something going on there that is worth examining, but I don't know if I could give it more context or explanation than that. But that's a huge part, and I don't know how to square that with people being allowed to act freely.
All I could say, I guess, in a couple sentences, is that, or a bit perhaps, I think I could sum this up in one sentence. I think you are put. I don't think you're allowing for the nuances in the opponent's arguments here. So, because, well, yeah, I said it was going to be a sentence. So,
yeah, I'm fine with that. I mean, I do my kind of due diligence to try to seek these things out. Unfortunately, as we both know, this is my constant thing that I always rope into a critique of democracy. But a lot of things that are out there are very like low form of discourse, right? So if you do try to seek content about this, it's either Dave Rubin saying 2 genders, or it's the Women's March tweeting out, trans women are women. So it's hard to, it's because people don't want to have discussions with other sides, which is why I think our conversation here is probably more enlightening than like 95% on the issue.
I mean, to give an example of what I'm talking about, like you mentioned the NPR thing about focusing on the people of color in service jobs, like focusing on them and not talking about the poor white people in service jobs. I don't think. I don't have to be a big NPR fan here, and I'm really not. But I don't think NPR is saying there are no poor white people. This could again. We don't have to go down the rabbit hole of framing, but I think it's you can say that, like, NPR can say, like, African Americans in service jobs have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and that's not to say that other groups haven't, or that's not to say, or if some crazy person on the internet says, if you don't date a trans woman, you're transphobic. That doesn't mean all trans people say that, and that doesn't even mean most people in the trans community or the LGBT community believe in nonsense like that. And you can't conflate these two things. So people can be. We have to, I think, in conversations like this, acknowledge, I guess, the nuance in everybody's position, if there is nuance. And I think in a lot of these cases there is nuance. I see you at some level, or I think your mistake comes in to be that's not
to be provocative about it.
To be provocative about it. Yeah, to go back to Jonathan Haidt's thing, I think your mistake comes in from thinking that your opponents are being more simplistic than they actually are.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. So I think we're on the same page, right? Okay, I think that's a good way to tie it up. I hope you guys got something of value from this one. I think this was better than our first attempt some ages ago. Because that one, if anybody's curious, we also tried to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment ended up leading half the conversation to be about how I think the Constitution is poorly applied in ways that is based on people reading whatever they want into it, combined with this same discussion. And as you can tell, those two things don't coincide very well. And what me and Matt like to do is we like to make 2 points, and the other person has to respond back to those 2 points, and then sometimes at a third point. So when half your brain has to be on constitutional interpretation and legal jurisprudence, it doesn't necessarily tie well with trying to square the circle of gender interpretations when it comes to Albanian people who swear celibacy to get equal rights. So I hope you guys got something of value out of this one. We have a whole slew of other episodes in our backlog if you want to explore those for other esoteric topics we debate. I recently started my own podcast where I just rant on things for quite a while. It's just my voice going full speed, droning on about something that's generally policy related. I know that this week I posted episodes about the minimum wage, Mitt Romney's op-ed on the stimulus bill, and I have one that's coming out tomorrow and one that's coming out today. One is second order consequences of the coronavirus policy and lockdowns. So talking about stuff like education. And there's another one that I swear to God, I do not remember off the top of my head. So you can find me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck or at the Obey Podcast if you want to just tell me that I'm wrong on everything, because I'm always happy to hear it.
And if you want to find my lovely face, you can go to YouTube and type in the Anti-Philosopher. As I've said before, that was where we originally put this podcast on YouTube, but then we created a Beyond Talking Points YouTube channel to distinguish the two things. So yeah, the Anti-Philosopher if you want to see me, the Obey Podcast if you want to see Matt.
Yeah, and then the beauty of going to the podcast for Beyond Talking Points, you find it on any podcatcher, but you can also find it on YouTube. The beauty of YouTube is you can see how in our more contentious arguments, when one of us is pontificating for about 3.5 minutes, the other person keeps on muting themselves and is like kind of trying to get the other person's attention. And you can just see the anguish building as we try to put coherent thoughts together while we're being, obviously. All of our conversations are intensely hateful and ad hominem attack filled. So you could see how upset we could get. It's not like we're remotely reasonable. but with all that said, I think we did a good job handling this one without getting too out there, even if we went on a bit of a tangent about Albanians for a minute there. So for now, until next time, signing off, it's Matt and Matt.